The letter arrived at the trading post 3 days after the man who carried it nearly died bringing it there, and even then, no one in the Kansas Territory knew quite what to do with it. Eliza Mae Calloway had been living alone on the homestead for 11 months by the time the spring of 1874 breathed something warmer into the flat, windswept plains of central Kansas. She was 22 years old, sharp-eyed and more stubborn than the clay soil she turned every morning with a rusted iron plow. Her father had built the homestead from nothing: 4 solid walls of sod, a cedar post fence, a well that pulled cold water from somewhere deep and merciful beneath the ground. And when he died the previous April of a fever that moved through his chest like a slow-burning coal, Eliza did not weep for long. She wept long enough to bury him properly, and then she went back to work. She had a small flock of chickens, 2 milk cows she called Mabel and June, and a garden plot that was showing its first green shoots of the season. She had a single-shot rifle she knew how to use, a cellar with enough preserved food to survive another month, and a stubbornness that her father had always said came from her mother's side of the family, though her mother had been gone since Eliza was 4. What she did not have was company or news from anywhere beyond the ridge of land to the east that marked the edge of her world. The nearest town, a weathered collection of buildings called Harrow Creek, sat 7 miles east across flat land that turned to mud in the spring rains and baked hard as brick in summer. Eliza went there once every 3 weeks or so to trade eggs and milk for flour, salt, and whatever else the general store carried that she could not produce herself. She kept to herself when she was in town. The women there looked at her with a mixture of pity and quiet judgment. A young woman farming alone was unusual enough to be uncomfortable, and the men looked at her in ways she preferred not to think about. It was during one of those trips to Harrow Creek on a Tuesday morning in the middle of April that she learned about the letter. She had pulled her small wagon up to the hitching post outside McCready's general store and was lifting down a crate of eggs when old Isaac McCready himself came out the front door with an expression on his face that she recognized immediately as the look of a man carrying news he was not sure how to deliver. "Miss Calloway," he said, pulling at the brim of his hat, "there's something inside you ought to see." She followed him in, past the barrels of dried beans and the hanging coils of rope, to the narrow counter where he conducted business. Beside the brass scale he used to weigh things sat a sealed envelope, thick with whatever it contained, its paper worn at the edges from handling. The handwriting on the front was not fine. It was cramped and forceful, written by someone who did not have occasion to write very often, and it said simply, "Eliza Mae Calloway, Harrow Creek, Kansas Territory." "Where did this come from?" she asked. "Fellow came through 3 days ago," McCready said, settling his considerable weight against the counter. "Name of Dawes. He was heading east to Abilene, and he left it here saying someone might know who it belonged to. I figured you'd be through before long." Eliza picked up the letter and turned it over. The seal on the back was red wax, pressed with a thumb rather than a stamp, and it had already been broken. Not by McCready, she judged, because McCready was many things, but not the sort to open other people's mail. And anyway, the flap was sealed back down with a small bit of paste that had dried unevenly. Someone along the way had read it. She did not open it there. She tucked it inside the front of her coat, traded her eggs and milk for what she needed, and drove the wagon home in a state of peculiar stillness. The letter sat against her chest like a second heartbeat, something foreign and important, and she did not look at it until she was inside her own 4 walls with the door latched against the April wind. Inside the envelope were 2 things. The first was a folded sheet of paper covered on both sides with that same cramped, forceful handwriting. The second was a smaller square of paper, newer and stiffer, which she set aside to read last. The letter was from her brother. Thomas Calloway, 7 years her senior and the last blood relative she had in the world, had gone west to Colorado Territory 5 years ago to try his luck in the silver mines near Leadville. He had written twice in that time, once to tell her he'd arrived, once to tell her he'd found work. And then silence had swallowed him as completely as the mountains had. She had assumed eventually that he was dead. She had grieved him in the private, soundless way she grieved things, and then she had put him in the place in her heart where she kept the people she'd lost and moved forward. But here was his handwriting, unmistakably his. She would have known it from 1,000 samples, the way certain letters leaned forward like they were always in a hurry. The letter was long and rambling in the way that letters written by people unaccustomed to writing always are, full of false starts and crossed-out words and information delivered out of order. But the essential facts emerged as she read, and when she was finished, she sat very still at her small table for a long while. Thomas was alive. He had been sick, a lung sickness that had kept him in a mining camp near a town called Granite Falls for nearly 2 years. But he was recovering. He had married a woman named Ruth, who was apparently from Missouri, and who had, according to Thomas, more courage and good sense than any person he'd ever met. They had a son, 18 months old, named Samuel after their father, and Thomas wanted Eliza to come west. He had a claim now, a good one, and a proper house, and Ruth's family was nearby. He wanted his sister. He had not known how to find her for the past 2 years because the sickness had taken something from his thinking, along with everything else. But he was clearer now, and Ruth had helped him write this, and they wanted her to come. The second piece of paper, the stiffer and newer one, was written in a different hand, Ruth's hand, Eliza assumed, smaller and more educated. It confirmed everything Thomas had said and added something of its own. "Thomas worries constantly about you," Ruth had written. "He wakes sometimes in the night saying your name. He would not rest easy if he knew you were managing that homestead alone. We have room, we have enough, and Samuel would love an aunt." Eliza sat with these 2 pieces of paper for a very long time. She wanted to go. She wanted it with a ferocity that surprised her, because she had spent 11 months convincing herself she did not need anyone, and here she was, undone by 2 pages of cramped ink and the image of a nephew named Samuel she had never met. But wanting to go and being able to go were different things entirely. She had no one to leave the homestead with, no money to pay for stage passage, no knowledge of how to get herself and whatever she needed across 400 miles of territory that was not known for being gentle with travelers. She fell asleep that night with the letter held against her chest, and she dreamed of mountains she had never seen. The solution to Eliza's problem arrived in Harrow Creek not 2 weeks later, and his name was Cole Bridger. He came in from the north on a horse that was not exactly a horse in the ordinary sense of the word, or rather it was a horse, but one that looked like it had been arguing with civilization since the day it was born and had been winning most of those arguments. The animal was a Mustang, a big, raw-boned one, with a coat the color of Red Canyon stone and a way of moving that made every other horse in the vicinity look domesticated by comparison. It had scars on its left shoulder from what looked like old rope burns, and its eyes were dark and watchful and not particularly interested in whether the humans around it felt comfortable. The man on its back was, in his own way, something of the same order. Cole Bridger stood just over 6 feet when he dismounted, broad across the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with padding and everything to do with years of hard physical work. His arms were heavy with muscle, the kind built not in vanity, but by necessity, by chopping wood and wrestling difficult terrain and hauling things that needed hauling. His hair was dark, nearly black, and longer than most men in settled towns would have worn it, curling slightly at the ends where it brushed the collar of his buckskin coat. His jaw was square and dusted with several days of dark stubble, and he had the particular kind of steadiness in his eyes that belonged to men who spent most of their time in places where there was nothing to look at but the horizon. He was 30 years old, though he looked both older and younger than that depending on the angle. Older in the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into distance and weather, younger in the way he moved, which was unhurried, and sure in the manner of someone who had never needed to perform confidence because he simply possessed it. He came to Harrow Creek because he needed supplies and because the trail he'd been following north from the Cimarron country had curved east more than he'd intended. He'd been trapping in the Cimarron River drainage for the winter, beaver mostly, though the beaver trade was not what it once had been, and a man had to supplement with deer and elk and whatever else the land offered. He was heading toward Colorado Territory because a man he'd wintered with had told him there was good country up in the mountains near Leadville, green valleys and clean water and elk so thick in the autumn you could hear them breathing from half a mile off. He did not intend to stay in Harrow Creek more than a few hours. He was eating a plate of beans and salt pork at the rough table inside McCready's. The general store doubled as the nearest thing the town had to a restaurant, when McCready himself, apparently constitutionally unable to let silence persist, began talking about the young woman on the homestead west of town who had a letter from her kin in Colorado and no way to answer it or respond to the invitation in it. Cole ate his beans and listened without appearing to listen, which was a skill he had developed over years of being in places where information moved through conversation, whether you asked for it or not. "She's been on that plot by herself since her father passed," McCready said, addressing no one in particular. "Her brother's out near Leadville, apparently doing well enough, wants her to come out. But there's no stage goes that direction from here, and she can't ride out alone, and I don't know that she's got the money for a guide even if one were available." "Where exactly near Leadville?" Cole asked. McCready looked at him with the alert expression of a man who has inadvertently caught something in a trap he forgot he set. "Town called Granite Falls. You know it. I've been through it." "Well," McCready said, settling into what was clearly going to be a full-scale effort at persuasion, "Miss Calloway is a sensible, capable young woman. She's not the kind to be any trouble on the trail. And she has some things she could trade. She's got good stock, and—" "I'm not looking for a traveling companion," Cole said, not unkindly, but plainly. "No," McCready agreed, "but you're going to Colorado Territory anyway, and the trail through the Republican River Valley isn't the kind a young woman ought to take alone, and—" "What does she know about trail travel?" McCready paused. "She rides well enough. She drove out here alone today, matter of fact." Cole ate the last of his beans, set down his fork, and looked at the wall for a moment in the particular way of a man conducting an internal argument with himself. Then he said, "Where's the homestead?" He rode out that same afternoon, not because McCready had persuaded him. McCready had not persuaded him, but because the story had settled under his skin the way certain things did, and he could not ride north without at least seeing for himself what the situation looked like. He told himself this was simple practicality. He was going to Colorado anyway. He knew the trail. If the woman was reasonable and could sit a horse and keep up, it was nothing to him to have a second person along. He found the homestead exactly where McCready said it would be, a sturdy sod house with a well-built fence and a kitchen garden that someone had been tending with real care. He noticed the quality of the fence posts and the clean line of the well cover before he noticed Eliza herself, which was itself a kind of judgment about priorities. Then she came out of the house, and he noticed her very much. She was not soft, which he had half expected from McCready's description. She was medium height and lean in the way that comes from hard work, with dark honey-colored hair pulled back from a face that was composed and alert, and not at all pleased to find a stranger on horseback in her yard. She was holding the rifle loosely at her side, not pointing it, but present with it, the way a sensible person in her situation would be. "Miss Calloway," he said from a respectful distance, keeping his hands visible. "My name is Cole Bridger. Isaac McCready told me about your situation. I'm heading to Colorado Territory. I thought we might talk." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the red Mustang, who was regarding her with those dark, watchful eyes. "You can water your horse," she said. "Then we'll talk." Her name, he learned over the next half hour, came with a personality that more than matched it. She was direct to the point of bluntness, asked specific questions. How many times had he made the trip west? What route did he intend to take? What were the current conditions on the Smoky Hill Trail? What did he expect of a traveling companion in terms of what she carried and what she contributed? And she listened to his answers with a focused attention that told him she was evaluating everything he said, rather than simply waiting for him to finish speaking. He told her the truth about all of it. The trip would take 3 to 4 weeks depending on weather and pace. The Republican River route was safer than the Smoky Hill Trail, which had seen Cheyenne raiding activity in the past year. She would need a good horse, and he did not think the plow horse currently standing in her small paddock was adequate for the terrain. She would need provisions for the trail. She would need to be able to ride 8 to 12 hours a day without complaint. "I have a horse," she said. "Mabel and June I can leave with the Hendersons. They're neighbors, 2 miles north. I have some dried food. What I do not have is money to pay you." "I'm not asking for payment." She looked at him steadily. Why not? It was the right question. He appreciated that she asked it. "Because I'm going to Colorado anyway, and the trail's safer with 2 people than 1, and whatever story you're carrying is your business, but it's enough to know that someone's waiting for you on the other end." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking through it, the risks, the necessity, the alternative which was staying here alone on this homestead, with a letter from her brother held against her chest and no way to answer it with her presence. "I'll leave the day after tomorrow," she said. "That gives me time to arrange things with the Hendersons and pack properly. If that doesn't suit you, I understand." "Day after tomorrow suits me," he said. "I'll camp tonight and tomorrow at the creek south of town." He turned the Mustang and rode. He did not look back, though he was aware, in the way he was always aware of things in his periphery, that she stood in the yard watching him go. The horse Eliza had, which she had not mentioned to Cole in their initial conversation, was a 4-year-old bay gelding she had purchased from a neighbor the previous fall with the last of what her father had left her. She had called him Copper for the color of his coat and sunlight, and she had spent the winter learning to ride him properly, not just the farm riding of leading in occasional short trips, but real riding, the kind where you and the horse reach an agreement about trust. She was better on him than she had let on to Cole, and she knew it, and she kept it to herself for reasons she did not entirely examine. She spent the next day and a half in a controlled state of purposeful activity. She rode to the Hendersons, explained the situation, and arranged for them to manage Mabel, June, and the chickens in exchange for the milk and eggs while she was gone. Agnes Henderson, who was 45 and had raised 6 children and had a philosophical acceptance of the unusual, gave her a jar of preserved peaches for the road and told her to be careful. Thomas Henderson, who was not philosophical about anything, told her 3 times that she was making a mistake, and she thanked him politely for his concern each time and then continued packing. She packed light and practical. 2 sets of clothing, a wool blanket, a rain slicker, her rifle and ammunition, a small amount of dried beef and hard cornbread, her father's compass, and the letters from Thomas and Ruth wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside the breast pocket of her riding coat. She thought about what else she should bring and decided against most of it. She thought about Cole Bridger. She had looked at him the way she looked at everything, with clear eyes and no sentiment. He was physically formidable in a way that was hard to ignore, and he had a quality of stillness about him that she associated with people who were genuinely comfortable alone. He did not have the look of a man who needed validation from anyone, which she found either reassuring or unsettling, depending on the moment. He had been respectful without being obsequious, and he had answered her questions honestly, including the ones that would have given a less straightforward man the opportunity to shade the truth. She did not trust easily. 11 months alone had not done much for her faith in people in general, but she trusted what she'd seen so far. What she did not do was think about the way he'd looked at her when she first came out of the house with the rifle. Not with fear, not with the calculated interest she was used to from men, but with a kind of level appraisal that felt, unexpectedly, like being seen. She set out at first light on the second day, Copper moving easily beneath her in the pink and gold morning air. She found Cole at the creek as he'd said, already saddled and packed, the red Mustang standing with that particular combination of alertness and patience that the horse seemed to maintain as its default state. Cole was crouched by the creek filling his canteen, and he stood when he heard her coming and looked her over with the same level appraisal she'd noticed before, this time evaluating horse and rider and pack together. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said. They rode west together into the morning. The first day out of Harrow Creek, they covered close to 30 miles across flat open country that the spring wind moved through like it owned everything. The grass was new and green along the creek bottoms and dry and brown on the uplands, and the sky was a vast and indifferent blue that seemed designed to make a person feel their own smallness. Cole set a pace that was brisk but not punishing, and Eliza matched it without complaint, which he noted without comment. He was not a talkative man by inclination. The mountains and rivers he spent his time in were not conversational, and he had adapted to their rhythms over 15 years of living mostly in wild country. But the silence between them on that first day was not uncomfortable. It was the functional quiet of 2 people moving purposefully through a shared space, and it had its own kind of companionable quality that neither of them remarked upon. They stopped once in the late morning to rest the horses and eat a brief meal. Cole watched the horizon with the automatic vigilance he carried everywhere, and Eliza watched it too, not from the same instinct, but from curiosity. The plains were not empty. They never were, if you looked carefully. There was a hawk working a thermal to the south. There were the tracks of pronghorn in a muddy stretch near the creek. There was a line of cottonwoods to the northwest that marked water. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, the first real question of the day. He considered it in the unhurried way he seemed to consider most things. Living in the mountains. Since I was 15. I went west with a trapper named Del Watkins from Missouri. He taught me the trade and then he died, and I kept going. How did he die? Horse slipped in a creek crossing, swept away. I didn't find him for 2 days. He said it matter-of-factly, not to be cold, but because it was simply what had happened, and he had made peace with it years ago. She nodded. My mother died when I was 4, my father last April. Now my brother is all the family I have left. Thomas, he said, remembering what McCready had told him. Thomas. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't know he was alive. I had stopped thinking of him as alive. There was something in her voice when she said this that he noticed but did not press. They ate their food and mounted up again and continued west. That evening they made camp on a low bench above the creek, sheltered on 3 sides by a stand of cottonwood that was just coming into leaf. Cole built a fire that was large enough to cook over and small enough not to be visible from far away, which was a distinction that people who had not spent time in open country rarely appreciated. He set up his own bedroll on the east side of the fire and gestured to the west side for her without comment. Eliza unsaddled Copper and hobbled him near the good grass at the edge of the bench, then came back to the fire where Cole had a small pot of coffee heating. She accepted the tin cup he offered her and wrapped her hands around it and felt the warmth move up her arms. The Mustang, she said. What's his name? Cole looked at the red horse, who was moving through the cottonwoods with the dignified purposefulness of an animal that declined to be hobbled and had been allowed to operate on the honor system. Red, he said. That's not much of a name. He doesn't seem to mind. She found herself wanting to smile, which surprised her. How long have you had him? 3 years. Found him running with a small band near the Cimarron. The others scattered, but he turned and looked at me. Just stood there. He looked into his coffee. Most horses run from you. He didn't. I figured that meant something. What did it mean? He thought about it for a moment. That he'd been watching me as long as I'd been watching him. And he decided I was acceptable. The fire snapped and sent a column of sparks up into the darkening sky. Above the cottonwoods, the first stars were appearing. Somewhere down in the creek bottom, a nighthawk called its sharp electric cry. My father used to say that the right animals choose you, Eliza said quietly, that you don't choose them. Your father sounds like he knew something. He knew a great deal. She stared into the fire. He just didn't know how to stay alive long enough to tell me all of it. The grief in her voice was not performative. It was the compressed, matter-of-fact grief of someone who has been carrying it for a long time and has learned to carry it quietly. Cole did not offer platitudes. He let the fire speak for a while, which was its own kind of comfort, and eventually she finished her coffee and said goodnight and wrapped herself in her blanket, and he sat up a while longer in the way he always did, watching the darkness, listening to the horses, doing the quiet maintenance of safety that the open country required. He did not examine too closely why the sound of her breathing on the other side of the fire made the night feel less like solitude and more like something else. The second day brought wind, not the gentle spring wind of the first day, but a proper plains wind that came out of the northwest with real intention. It pushed against them from the side, making the horses work harder and filling their ears with a constant moving noise that wore at the nerves by afternoon. Eliza tied her hat under her chin with a strip of leather and leaned into it, and Cole watched her do this with the rope and the hat and thought, again, that she was not soft. They crossed a wide, shallow tributary of the Republican River around midday, a passage that required the horses to pick their way through knee-deep water over uncertain footing. Red went across with the confidence of an animal that had done this 1,000 times. Copper balked at the edge, stepping back and forth in the agitated way of a young horse, uncertain about moving water. He's not wrong to be careful, Cole said, pausing on the far bank. Let him smell it. Don't force him. Eliza held the reins steady and waited, letting Copper reach his nose down to the water's surface. She was patient with him in a way that Cole noticed, not the impatient patience of someone waiting for an animal to obey, but actual patience, the real kind, where you genuinely allowed the horse to arrive at his own decision. After about 30 seconds, Copper stepped in, placed his feet carefully, and crossed without further drama. Good, Cole said. He just needed to know it was real, Eliza said. He's young. He's still learning that the scary things don't always kill you. Cole looked at her and she looked at him, and there was a beat of something in the air between them that neither of them acknowledged before they turned and continued riding west. By the afternoon of the third day, they had left the most settled country behind them and were moving through territory that was emptier and wilder. The Republican River country here was beautiful in the spare, uncompromising way of the plains in spring, wide and golden and enormous, the sky pressing down on everything with its blue enormity, the grass moving in slow waves. They saw buffalo in the distance, a small herd moving north with the seasonal certainty of animals that have been doing the same thing for longer than anyone could count. "They're not as thick as they used to be," Cole said, watching them. "My father remembered when they went past the homestead in herds that took 3 days to pass," Eliza said. He said the ground shook. "The hunters." He said it simply, without editorializing, but there was something compressed behind the word. "You don't hunt them?" "I take what I need for food. I don't run them down in hundreds for hides." He paused. "I've seen what the range looks like after the hide hunters come through. It's not something you forget." Eliza was quiet. She had heard about the hide hunters, everyone on the plains had, and she had felt, in a vague way, that something was being lost. Having it named plainly made the loss more specific and more real. "My father used to trade with the Cheyenne when I was small," she said after a while. "Before things got bad. He said they were the best judges of horseflesh he'd ever encountered." Cole nodded. "They were." He let the word sit. "What happened to the Cheyenne bands in your area is not—" He paused, choosing his words. "There were wrongs done, more than most people who live in Kansas will tell you." "I know," she said. "I was 9 years old when the news came through about what happened at Sand Creek down in Colorado. My father sat at the table that night and didn't speak for a long time." "He sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was," Eliza said, and nothing more. They camped that night in a hollow where a spring fed a small pool surrounded by willow scrub, and Cole shot a prairie chicken late in the afternoon that Eliza cleaned and roasted over the fire with a competence that surprised him, or would have surprised him if he had not already been revised several times in his initial assumptions about her. She made coffee with the last of her ground beans, and they sat by the fire as the temperature dropped with the darkness in the way it does on the plains, sharply and completely, the warmth of the day vanishing like it had been a suggestion rather than a fact. "Tell me about the mountains," she said. He looked at her across the fire. "What about them? What they're like? I've never seen them." He thought for a moment about how to describe a thing that he had mostly experienced rather than spoken of. "The first time you see them from the plains," he said slowly, "they look like a mistake, like something that doesn't belong. The land is flat, and then it's not. It just goes up like someone drew a line and said everything on this side is different from everything on that side." She was listening with her full attention, the cup held in both hands, her face lit by the fire. "Up in the high country it's cold even in summer. The air is thinner, and it tastes different. Cleaner, I guess, but also sharper. The elk come into the valleys in the fall, and you can hear them bugling from miles away. In the winter, the snow comes hard, and the passes close, and everything goes quiet in a way that's different from plains quiet. Plains quiet is horizontal. Mountain quiet has weight to it. It comes down from above." "That sounds," she said, and stopped, and then said, "terrifying and wonderful." "Yes," he agreed. "Both." They were quiet for a long while after that, listening to the fire and the distant sound of coyotes working the dark in their methodical, ancient way. The stars were extraordinary out here, with nothing to compete with them, dense and brilliant and arranged in their timeless patterns overhead. "Cole," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name. "Yes? Why are you really going to Colorado?" He looked at the fire. "I told you, the country up near Leadville." "I know what you told me," she said. "I'm asking what you didn't tell me." He was quiet for long enough that she thought perhaps she'd overstepped, crossed some line of privacy that a more cautious person would have seen and respected. Then he said, "I had a place once, up in the Rockies, above a valley near the headwaters of the Arkansas River. A cabin I built myself, good hunting ground, clean water. I spent 4 winters there." "What happened to it?" Nothing happened to it. It's still there as far as I know. A pause. I left. I've been moving since. I tell myself it's because the country to the south had better trapping, and that's true enough. But the real reason is that a place you built alone feels different once you've built it. Different how? Small, he said. Quiet in the wrong way. She looked at him steadily for a moment, and then she looked back at the fire, and he had the feeling, irrational, unwelcome, that she had understood something he had not intended to say. "Good night, Cole," she said. "Good night, Eliza." The using of her name felt, to both of them, like a small and significant thing, though neither of them would have said so. On the fourth day, they crossed into Nebraska territory, briefly, following the river's curve, and the land changed subtly, growing more rolling, the grasses higher and the creek bottoms deeper. Cole was watching the weather as he always did, reading the clouds that were building to the northwest, with the particular attention of a man whose life had several times depended on getting this particular reading right. "We're going to get wet," he said around noon. "How wet?" "Very. There's a ranch house about 4 miles west. I passed it 2 years ago. We push hard. We might make it under roof." They pushed hard. Red extended himself into a long, ground-eating trot that was his natural traveling pace, and Copper, younger and not quite as experienced but game, kept up with an enthusiasm that he seemed to have recently discovered. Eliza rode with her weight balanced and her hands quiet, and Cole, watching her in his peripheral vision, revised his assessment again upward. The ranch house appeared on the crest of a low rise, a proper house this time, not sod but frame, with a barn attached by a covered walkway. A man was coming out of the barn as they rode up, and Cole recognized him after a moment as a cattleman named Orrin Fletcher, who had been running a small herd in this country for 3 years. "Bridger," Fletcher said with the pleased surprise of someone who keeps finding the same coin in their coat pocket. "You're not dead." "Not yet," Cole said. "This is Miss Calloway. We're heading to Colorado. Mind if we shelter until this passes?" Fletcher looked at the black wall of cloud that was now close enough that the first breath of cold pre-storm air was hitting their faces. "Get the horses in the barn," he said. "Supper's in an hour." The storm hit 20 minutes later, with a full commitment to being impressive. Thunder that came so close together, it was more like one continuous sound than separate cracks, rain driven sideways by a wind that found every gap in the barn's old boards. Eliza sat on a hay bale with her hands around a cup of Fletcher's strong, terrible coffee and watched lightning illuminate the plains in great white flashes through the barn door that they'd left cracked to watch the weather. Cole sat beside her, close enough that she was aware of the particular warmth that a large person radiates, which in the chill that the storm had brought was not unwelcome. He was eating hardtack from his pack with the methodical patience of a man who eats not for pleasure, but for fuel. And she found herself thinking, somewhat against her own better judgment, that she liked the way he existed in the world, without fuss, without performance, taking things as they came and dealing with them on their own terms. "You've been through storms like this before," she said, "many times. Does it get less frightening?" He thought about this honestly. The lightning does, the flooding doesn't if you're near water. Respect the water. He looked at her. "Are you frightened now?" "Not particularly," she said. "I've sat out storms alone in a sod house. At least here there's company." Something in the word company landed between them with a weight that neither of them immediately addressed. The storm raged outside. Red and Copper stood in their stalls with the equine acceptance of animals who know shelter when they find it, and Orrin Fletcher's lantern cast its warm and unsteady light over the bay of old hay and worn saddle leather. "Tell me about Thomas," Cole said. She looked at him. It was the first time he had asked about her purpose in all this, rather than the practical elements of getting there, and it felt like a gift. An acknowledgement that the letter and what it contained mattered as much as the trail conditions. "Thomas is 7 years older than me," she said. "When my mother died, he was the one he took care of me, mostly. My father worked all the time, which was not a criticism, it was necessary. But Thomas was the one who sat with me when I was sick, who walked me to the creek to fish, who told me about our mother because he remembered her and I didn't." She was quiet for a moment. "When he went west, I understood why. He needed something that the plains weren't giving him, but it was like losing a limb. You learn to do without, but you always know the limb is missing. Cole nodded slowly. And now he has a son, Eliza said, and her voice caught briefly and then steadied. A son named Samuel, and I've never met him. He's 18 months old, and I've never seen his face. Cole said nothing for a moment. Then, we'll get you there. It was not a declaration or a boast. It was simply a statement of fact delivered with the same matter-of-fact certainty he applied to everything, and it reached her more deeply than any elaborate reassurance would have, precisely because of that plainness. I know, she said. I believe that. The storm passed in the night, and they left Orrin Fletcher's ranch at dawn with the world washed clean and the creeks running high and brown. Cole kept them away from the main creek crossings for the first half of the day, following high ground and reading the drainage. He understood water the way he understood most things in wild country, from long observation and the willingness to be patient when patience was what the situation required. By midday, the sun was brilliant and hot, and the wet plains steamed lightly, giving the whole country a warm, living smell, grass and mud and wild sage, that Eliza found unexpectedly intoxicating. On the 5th and 6th days, they moved steadily southwest, following Cole's internal geography through country that became gradually more varied, lower hills appearing on the horizon, the creek beds cutting deeper, the grass beginning to mix with sage and yucca as they moved into drier country. They fell into a routine, the way people traveling together do, a rhythm of early starts and late camps, and the particular easy conversation that develops between people who spend long hours moving through the same space. She learned things about him in the gradual way you learn things about a person who does not volunteer information, but answers honestly when asked. He had grown up in Missouri, on a small farm, the third of 5 children. His father had been a difficult man. Cole did not say cruel, but she heard it in the careful way he didn't. He had been trapping since he was 15, as he'd said, and he had been to the mountains and back more times than he could accurately count. He had been to California once, following a rumor about gold, and found the gold country depleted and crowded and disorganized, and turned around and gone back east to the mountains. He had never been married. "Have you wanted to be?" she asked on the 6th evening, sitting by the fire. "Wanting it and being right for it aren't the same thing," he said. "What does that mean?" He looked at his hands, which were large and scarred and capable. "A man who lives the way I live, there's not much room in it for another person. Not because I don't want company. Because I've never been sure I knew how to—" He stopped. "Make space," he finished. "Make space," she repeated, "for another person." "Yes." She was quiet, turning this over. "My father used to say that the things we tell ourselves we're not capable of are usually the things we're most afraid of." He looked at her across the fire. She met his eyes without looking away, and the fire between them was not the only thing that had warmth. "He sounds like he was a wise man," Cole said. "He was," Eliza said, "and he was right about most things." On the 8th day, crossing into Colorado territory, the land began to change in earnest. The mountains appeared exactly as Cole had described them, a dark line on the western horizon that resolved, as they rode toward it, into something vast and improbable and astonishing. Eliza pulled Copper to a stop when the full extent of the range became clear, the way it rose from the plains not gradually but suddenly, rank upon rank of peaks reaching into the blue sky, snow still white on the high places. She did not say anything. She just looked. Cole had stopped Red beside her, and he looked at her looking at the mountains, and there was something on his face in that moment that he did not bother to conceal because he did not know it was visible. It was the particular expression of a person who has discovered that watching someone else see something beautiful for the first time is its own kind of seeing. "It's exactly as you said," she said at last. "It's different every time," he said, "but it's always like the first time." She turned to look at him, and the mountains were behind her, and the plains were behind him, and the April sun was strong on both of them. "Thank you for this," she said, simply, without excess. "You haven't gotten there yet," he said, and there was something almost gentle in the dryness of it. "I know," she said. "I mean for all of it, the last 8 days. I mean those too." He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded, which was his way, and they turned toward the mountains and kept riding. The country changed dramatically as they moved into the foothills, the flat plains giving way to rolling ground, cut by streams that ran fast and cold from snowmelt, the air thinning slightly and tasting different, cleaner, with the edge of pine on it, exactly as Cole had described. The horses moved differently here, copper with a new wariness about the terrain, and red with what appeared to be something close to satisfaction. They followed the Arkansas River drainage north, which was the route Cole knew, and on the 10th day they passed through a small settlement called Cannon City, and Cole asked about the road to Granite Falls. The man at the livery there, a broad-faced fellow with the slow speech of someone who had lived at elevation long enough to stop being in a hurry, told them it was 2 days north and some east, along a route that was good most of the season, but had a stretch above the tree line that could be rough this early in the year. "The pass clear?" Cole asked. "For now," the man said, "but there's still snow up high. It'll be fine if you move steady." They rested for 1 full day in Cannon City. The horses needed it, and so did Eliza, though she would not have said so. Cole arranged for them to board the horses at the livery, and they took rooms at the small hotel, which was really just a house whose owner had added 3 extra beds to 2 back rooms. Eliza lay on the hard mattress and felt the absence of saddle beneath her, and thought about Thomas and Ruth and the child named Samuel, and what it would be like to see her brother's face after 5 years. She thought about Cole as well, which she was becoming less able to prevent. She went downstairs in the evening to find him sitting in the hotel's front room with the owner, a woman named Mrs. Park, who had come to Colorado Territory from Ohio 10 years ago with her husband, who had subsequently died of a mine accident, and who had simply stayed because she had nowhere more suited to her anywhere else. Mrs. Park was practical and intelligent, and had taken an immediate liking to Eliza, and was now apparently taking a liking to Cole as well, judging by the way she had him engaged in what appeared to be a comfortable conversation about the valley country to the north. "Your man knows his country," Mrs. Park said to Eliza, with a cheerful imprecision of language that Eliza chose not to correct. Cole looked at Eliza with a perfectly composed expression. "I was telling Mrs. Park about the elk in the high valleys." "He says they come down into the meadows in the late afternoon," Mrs. Park said. "They do," Eliza said, sitting down, as if she knew this from her own experience rather than from listening to Cole describe it by firelight. Mrs. Park served them supper. Proper supper, beef stew with biscuits, the first real meal either of them had eaten off a stove in 10 days, and afterward sat with them in the common room and talked about life in Colorado Territory with the frank authority of someone who had been here long enough to know the difference between what things were supposed to be and what they actually were. "The mining country up near Leadville draws all kinds," she said. "Some of them are good and some of them are not, and you can't always tell by looking which is which. But the valley settlements, Granite Falls being one, those are quieter. More the farming and ranching kind. People who come to stay." "My brother lives near Granite Falls," Eliza said. "Thomas Calloway?" Mrs. Park said, and Eliza stared at her. "You know him?" "I know of him. His wife Ruth came through here last autumn with the baby, heading south to visit her family. She stopped here for a night. Pleasant woman. She mentioned her husband's people." Eliza sat forward. "What? How did he seem? From what she said?" "She said he was doing much better, that the mountain air had cleared his lungs and that he was getting his strength back proper. She seemed happy." Eliza leaned back in her chair and pressed her lips together. She felt, unexpectedly, the sharp pressure of tears behind her eyes that she refused to release in public, and she blinked them back with the same physical discipline she applied to most things that tried to undo her. She felt, across the table, Cole's hand briefly and carefully come to rest over hers. Just for a moment, just long enough to say, "I know. I see this." And then he removed it, and she breathed steadily, and the moment passed, but it did not pass completely. The next morning they set out north toward the mountains with a proper meal in them, and the horses rested, and the trail climbed steadily through pine forest that smelled of resin and cold water. The high country opened around them gradually. First, the thick ponderosa stands, then the spruce and fir higher up, then the long open meadows just below the tree line where the snow still lay in patches, and the first spring flowers were pushing up through the edges of it with the cheerful indestructibility of small growing things. The pass was not quite what the liveryman in Cannon City had characterized as easy-going. There was still a substantial patch of old snow across the highest section, crusted and icy on the surface, and both horses had to be carefully managed through it. Red went across with his usual mountaineer's efficiency. Copper went carefully, placing each foot with deliberation, and Eliza let him take his time. Cole went first, and then turned at the far side to watch her come across, his hand on Red's neck, his eyes steady and tracking every step. He did not call out to her or give her instructions. She was handling it correctly, and he had learned, over the past 10 days, that she did not want to be instructed in things she was already doing right. He watched because it was his nature to watch the people in his care, and he realized, coming up against the word in his own mind, that he thought of her as being in his care, and that this had happened without his fully intending it to. She came across cleanly, Copper slipping once on an icy patch and then recovering with the particular athleticism of a young horse finding his feet, and she was smiling when she reached the far side. Not the relief smile of someone who was afraid, but the alive smile of someone for whom difficulty encountered and overcome was its own specific pleasure. "Good," he said. "He's learning," she said, patting Copper's neck. "We both are." Something about the way she said this made him look at her for a moment longer than he needed to. The mountains were in all directions, and the spring sky was deep blue above the snowfields, and she was sitting her horse with the easy authority she had grown into over the past 10 days of riding, and her hair had come partially loose from its braid in the wind of the crossing and was curling around her face. And he thought, quite clearly, quite simply, in a way he'd been avoiding thinking for a week, that he was in a great deal of trouble. He turned Red north, and they descended the far side of the pass into a long valley that curved between dark peaks and opened, as they dropped lower, into a country of aspen and open meadow and the sound of fast water over stone. "We'll be there tomorrow," Cole said. Eliza said nothing for a moment. Then, "Are you going to stay in the area after?" "I don't know," he said. And then, more honestly, "I had been thinking about going further north." "I see," she said, "but I haven't decided." "I see," she said again, and this time there was something different in her voice, not hurt, not demanding, but present with the fact of the question and its implications in a way that told him she was not going to pretend the question didn't matter. They rode through the afternoon in the particular quiet of two people thinking about the same thing from different angles, and the valley opened wider beneath them, and the evening came on with the sharp, clear cold of mountain springtime. And they made their last trail camp in a bend of the river where the cottonwoods were just beginning to put out their first soft leaves. Cole built the fire larger than usual. The cold at this elevation after dark was real and serious. Eliza sat close to it, and he sat close to it, and there was not the same distance between them that there had been on that first night on the Kansas plains, not because either of them had made a conscious decision about it, but because 10 days of shared trail and weather and conversation had moved them, naturally and inevitably, closer. "I need to tell you something," Eliza said. He looked at her. "When you came to my homestead and I agreed to come with you," she said, "I told myself it was practical, that I needed to get to Thomas and you were the practical means of it. Wasn't it?" "It was partly that," she said, "but it was also—" She stopped and collected herself. "I've been alone for a long time. My father was he was a good man, but he was not warm exactly, not after my mother died, and Thomas left. And I've been—" She looked at the fire. "I've been hungry for something I couldn't have named, and when you sat in my kitchen and answered my questions honestly and didn't try to manage me or diminish me, I thought, here's a person worth knowing." Cole was very still. "I'm not saying this to make you feel obligated," she said with a directness that was purely her own. "I'm saying it because I don't think it's fair to get to Granite Falls tomorrow and have you ride away north without you knowing that the last 10 days have been—" She pressed her lips together briefly. "The best 10 days I can remember." The fire crackled. Red moved through the cottonwoods with his familiar dignified sound. Copper, hobbled nearby, pulled contentedly at the new spring grass. Cole Bridger sat for a long moment looking at Eliza Calloway across the fire, and the thing that had been growing in him since she came out of her house with a rifle and a clear-eyed look of assessment and asked him honest questions moved through the last of the distance it had been covering and arrived, fully and without qualification, at its destination. "Eliza," he said. "Yes. I've been telling myself I wasn't sure I knew how to make space for another person," he said, "and I've been proving myself wrong for 10 days. She looked at him steadily. "I don't want to ride north," he said. "I want to know your brother. I want to see you meet his son. I want—" He stopped, and something in his expression was not composed, was, for once, visible, the way a fire is visible when you take the lantern glass away. "I want to make space, if you'll let me." Eliza Mae Calloway, who had been strong and self-sufficient and controlled for so long that she sometimes forgot what it felt like to simply want something, looked at this man across the fire, this large, quiet, mountain-made man with his long dark hair and his capable scarred hands and his honest eyes, and she let herself want it. "I'll let you," she said. He moved around the fire to her side, and she did not move away, and he sat beside her and looked at her face in the firelight, and then he kissed her. Not urgently, but with the same deep, unhurried care he brought to everything, and it was exactly like that. She kissed him back with her whole self, which was also exactly like her. They held each other for a long time beside the fire, with the mountain dark all around them and the river talking to itself in its ancient cold voice and the cottonwood leaves rustling their first spring whisper overhead, and it felt, to both of them, like arriving somewhere. Morning came to the mountain valley in stages. First the gray behind the peaks, then a band of gold, then the full sunlight rolling down the slopes and filling the valley from above. They were already riding when it reached them, heading north on a wagon track that wound through meadow and forest along the river. The day was clean and cold and brilliant, and neither of them spoke much, but the silence between them had changed again, had taken on yet another quality, warm now and complete. The silence of people who have said the important things and do not need to fill the space with lesser ones. They saw the smoke from the settlement's chimneys first, then the roof lines of buildings between the trees, then the valley floor opening into the wider flat where Granite Falls had established itself along the river's calmer lower stretch. It was a small town, perhaps 30 structures, a mix of frame houses and log buildings, a church, a general store, a blacksmith's shop. In 1874, it was the kind of settlement that was still deciding what it was going to be, not yet large enough to be sure of itself, but not small enough to be fragile. Cole asked at the general store for Thomas Calloway's place, and the storekeeper, a heavy-set man with a red beard who introduced himself as Pierce, pointed them down a lane that ran east from the main road and said the Calloway homestead was the second one along, with the split-rail fence. The fence was exactly as described, and beyond it was a prosperous-looking homestead, not large but solid, the kind of place built by someone who understood both construction and the long term. A kitchen garden had been started along the south wall of the house. There was a real barn, small but sturdy, and a corral with 2 horses and a mule. A woman came out of the house as they rode up to the gate. She was perhaps 28, with dark red hair and the look of someone who was almost never at rest. Active eyes, quick movements, a baby on her hip who was clearly alive and well-fed and deeply interested in the horses. She looked at Eliza, and then recognition moved across her face, though they had never met. "You're Eliza," she said. "Thomas said you had your father's eyes." "You're Ruth," Eliza said, and her voice was unsteady for the first time in this whole journey. "He's in the barn," Ruth said. "He's been in there all morning, not doing anything useful, just—" Her voice became warmer. "Just waiting. We got your letter 2 weeks ago. He hasn't slept properly since." Eliza dismounted and handed Copper's reins to Cole without looking at him and walked to the barn. Cole sat his horse and held both animals, and Ruth came to the fence with the baby on her hip and looked up at him with those bright, quick eyes. "Cole Bridger," he said. "Ruth Calloway," she said. "You brought her safe." "She brought herself safe," he said. "I just knew the trail." Ruth looked at him with the particular assessment of a woman who is immediately good at reading people. "I don't think that's entirely true," she said, and shifted the baby on her hip. "Would you like to meet Samuel?" From inside the barn came the sound of a door, and then a voice, a man's voice, low and rough with something like pain or something like joy, which were sometimes indistinguishable, saying a name that was not a word so much as an entire history compressed into 2 syllables. "Eliza." And then a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing but contained both, from two voices at once. Cole Bridger sat quietly on his red Mustang in the spring sunshine of Granite Falls, Colorado territory, and felt the warmth of what was happening in that barn move through him like the heat of a good fire. He reached out and took the baby Samuel, who was 8 months old by birth and apparently equipped with a complete personality from the start, and who grabbed his large finger with a grip that was, by any reasonable assessment, impressive. "He likes you," Ruth said. "He likes my finger," Cole said. "That's how it starts," Ruth said. Thomas Calloway came out of the barn 10 minutes later with Eliza beside him, his arm around her shoulders and her hand holding his forearm, and Cole saw immediately where Eliza's particular quality of composure and directness came from. Thomas was taller and heavier than his sister, with the same dark honey coloring and the same clear-eyed look, though in him it was set in a face that had clearly been ill and was still in the process of becoming fully itself again. He moved carefully, with the particular conservatism of someone who had learned to respect their own limits, but his eyes were alive and present. He looked at Cole, holding his son, and something in his expression shifted into a question. "Thomas," Eliza said, "this is Cole Bridger. He brought me from Kansas." "He rode with you from Kansas?" Thomas said. "Across the whole of it," Eliza said, and there was something in her voice that Thomas Calloway, who had known his sister all her life, clearly heard and accurately interpreted, because he looked at Cole with a different kind of attention than the polite interest he'd started with. Cole handed Samuel back to Ruth, dismounted, and shook Thomas Calloway's hand. The handshake was the handshake of two men who recognized in each other a certain plainness and were comfortable with it. "I owe you more than I can say," Thomas said. "You don't owe me anything," Cole said. "Your sister is her own woman. I just knew the way." "He keeps saying that," Ruth said from the gate with the tone of a woman who knows a man is underselling himself and finds it both endearing and mildly exasperating. Thomas looked between Cole and his sister with the calm of a man who has been sick long enough to have developed perspective. "Come inside," he said. "There's coffee and Ruth made bread this morning, and I want to hear about all of it." They went inside. The days that followed were some of the fullest that Eliza could remember since her childhood, when Thomas had been at the center of everything and the world had felt complete. Thomas was thinner than she remembered and moved with a care that spoke of illness survived, but his mind was sharp and his humor was dry and intact, and Ruth was exactly the woman Eliza had imagined from the letter, capable and warm and quietly funny, with a directness that matched Eliza's own and a love for Thomas that was evident in every interaction, not performatively, but in the small practical ways of real feeling. And Samuel, who was 18 months old and had apparently decided to dedicate his considerable energies to the mastery of walking and the systematic investigation of everything within reach, was the most purely delightful person Eliza had ever met. He had Thomas's dark hair and Ruth's green eyes and no respect whatsoever for the concept of personal space, and he took to Cole with an enthusiasm that Cole accepted with the same composed patience he applied to everything. Within 3 days, Samuel had developed a game that involved bringing Cole various objects, a wooden spoon, a river stone, a dried corn cob, and waiting for Cole to respond appropriately, which appeared to mean receiving each object gravely and then returning it with equal gravity, after which Samuel would toddle away satisfied and return with something else. Cole played this game with such perfect seriousness that even Ruth, who was not easily moved to laughter, found herself smiling. Cole stayed. He had said he hadn't decided whether to go north, and then he simply did not go north, and no one made a pointed observation about this because the reason was self-evident to everyone present. He helped Thomas with the work of the homestead, which was considerable. There were fences to repair after the winter, a section of roof on the barn that had shifted, ground to be prepared for spring planting. He worked with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything, and Thomas worked beside him, and the two men fell into the easy rhythm of people who understand work and do not need to explain themselves to each other while doing it. "He's a good man," Thomas said to Eliza one evening, when Cole had gone to the barn to check on the horses and Ruth had put Samuel to bed. "I know," Eliza said. "Are you happy?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am becoming happy," she said. "I think that is more honest than simply yes." Thomas looked at her with his clear, quiet eyes. "She said I'd know when she was the one," he said. "Ruth, I mean. She said I'd feel it the way you feel a change in weather, not just see it coming, but feel it and hear." He pressed a hand against his chest. "Do you feel it?" "I feel something," Eliza said. "Something I have no comparison for." "That's it," Thomas said. "That's exactly it." 3 weeks after they arrived in Granite Falls, on a warm evening in May, Cole asked Eliza to walk with him by the river. The river here ran shallow and wide over a bed of smooth stones, and in the late evening it caught the last gold of the sunset and ran with it downstream. The mountains were all around, enormous and still, and the aspen groves on the lower slopes were in full leaf now, shimmering in the light evening breeze with the particular silver-green trembling that gave them their name. They walked along the bank in the way they had fallen into, side by side, not quite touching, with the awareness of each other that was now simply a fact of their existence, like gravity or sunlight. Red had followed them from the corral, as he sometimes did, moving along the bank at a respectful distance and grazing with studied innocence. Cole stopped at a bend in the river where a large flat boulder sat half in the water, sun-warmed from the day. Eliza sat on it, and he sat beside her, and the river went past them in its unhurried way. "I need to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said in her direct way. He looked at the river. He was not a man who performed emotion, and because of that what he felt showed itself in small, precise ways, the set of his jaw, the particular stillness that came over him when something mattered. "I have been in the mountains and on the plains for 15 years, he said, "and I have never found a reason to stop moving. I told you that the cabin I built felt small when I built it alone. I told you I didn't know how to make space." He looked at her. "I know how to make space. I've been making it for 3 weeks, and it does not feel small." Eliza looked at him steadily, her hands in her lap. "I want to build a place," he said. "Here, or near here, or wherever you want to be. I want to build it with you. I want—" He stopped, and what crossed his face was not vulnerability exactly, but honesty, stripped of all its protection, which is sometimes the same thing. "I want to wake up in the morning and know you're there. I want to spend the rest of my life knowing what comes next because you're what comes next." The river ran past. The mountains held their positions. Red grazed placidly downstream as though nothing of consequence was happening in the world. "Cole Bridger," Eliza said. "Yes, you are the most straightforward man I have ever met in my life. Is that—" "It is the best thing I have ever been told," she said, and she reached over and put her hand against his jaw, which was rough with the perpetual stubble that seemed to be his natural condition, and she kissed him there by the river with the evening light all around them and the mountains watching. When she pulled back, he was looking at her with that fully visible expression she had first seen on the pass when she came over it on copper, that expression of a man who has lowered the glass from the lantern. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is very much a yes," she said. They were married in June. The ceremony was performed by the pastor of the small church in Granite Falls, a man named Aldrich, who was soft-spoken and had the permanent look of someone slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was repeatedly asked to officiate over. Thomas stood with Cole, which pleased both men in a way that they expressed by not talking about it. Ruth stood with Eliza and held Samuel, who was deeply interested in the flowers that Ruth had woven into Eliza's hair and kept reaching for them throughout the ceremony, with an expression of pure scientific curiosity. Eliza wore a dress that Ruth had helped her make from blue calico and white lace that Pierce's general store had improbably carried in a back corner. Cole wore his cleanest clothes, which were the best he had, and he had trimmed his dark hair to just below his collar, and he stood at the front of that small church looking at Eliza walk up the aisle with a steadiness in his face that the people present would talk about for a long time afterward. Not the rigid steadiness of someone holding themselves together, but the genuine steadiness of a man who is exactly where he wants to be, and has no ambivalence about it. When Eliza reached him and took his hands, she felt the roughness of his palms against hers and the warmth that came through them. And she thought of the first time he had held her hand briefly across a hotel table, and the last camp on the trail, and the river bend. And she was so full of everything that she had to breathe very carefully through the ceremony to keep from embarrassing herself. The pastor asked the questions and they answered them, and when Cole said, "I do," It was in the same plain, unhesitating way he said every true thing. And Eliza said it the same way, and the small congregation of Thomas and Ruth and Samuel and Mrs. Park, who had ridden up from Cannon City for the occasion, and Orrin Fletcher, who had happened to be passing through, and a handful of Granite Falls residents who had come to know the newcomers over the weeks. All of them felt what happens in a room when two people mean something absolutely. Afterward, there was food and music, a fiddle player from town who knew a great many songs and was happy to play them, and the long summer evening stretched out warm and luminous around them. Thomas and Cole sat together on the steps of the church in the late light, each with a cup of hard cider that Pierce had contributed, not talking much in the way of the two men they had become to each other, watching Ruth dance with Eliza in the open ground in front of the church, while Samuel sat on the grass between them and clapped his hands in approximate time with the music. "Well," Thomas said. "Well," Cole agreed. "She'll give you a time of it," Thomas said. "She's not easy to live with." "I know. She's worth every minute of it." "I know that too," Cole said. Thomas looked at him with those clear, direct eyes that were Eliza's eyes in a different face. "Take care of her," he said, "not as a command, but as the offering of something precious from one person's hands to another's." "I will," Cole said. "All of my life." Cole built the house in the late summer and fall of 1874, in a meadow half a mile up the valley from Thomas and Ruth's homestead, close enough for company and far enough for privacy. He had the skills for it, 15 years of building and maintaining structures. In wild country had given him a thorough education in what made a structure sound, and he built it well, not large, but solid. 2 rooms with a loft, a proper chimney, windows on 3 sides to let in the mountain light that was different from plains light, having more angles to arrive from. Eliza worked beside him when she could, learning quickly what was needed and applying herself to it with the thoroughness she applied to everything. She also managed the kitchen garden and helped Ruth with the canning and preserving that would carry both households through winter. And she spent time each day with Samuel, who was growing and talking and had recently discovered that he could make Cole produce a specific expression of suppressed amusement by placing objects on his head and then looking at him expectantly. In October, when the aspens turned gold and the first cold came down from the high country, they moved into the new house. They stood together in the empty main room, with the fire going for the first time in the new chimney, and the smell of fresh-cut wood and smoke and the mountain air coming through the window filled everything. "It's not small," Eliza said. Cole looked around the room that he had built with his own hands for the person who was now standing beside him in it. "No," he said, "it is not." She put her arm around him, around his waist, which was as far as she could comfortably reach given the relevant dimensions of both parties, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood in their house in the October mountains and felt the completeness of the thing. The winter came hard and clean, the way mountain winters do, not the grinding cold of the plains, but the deep, crystalline cold of high altitude, heavy snow that muffled the world and turned the valley into something from a story. Cole was in his element in a way Eliza found extraordinary to watch. He moved through the winter country with a comfort that was almost joyful, tending the animals, hunting when the weather allowed, teaching Eliza the things she needed to know about surviving at this elevation that were different from what the plains had taught her. She was an excellent student, which he had expected, and she was better company in a snowbound cabin than anyone he had ever spent time with, which he had suspected but not known for certain. She read to him in the evenings from the books Ruth had brought from Missouri. She had a reading voice that was warm and expressive, and she did not rush, and he told her things about the country that were not in any book, and they talked through the long evenings about everything from the practical to the profound, and he thought repeatedly, in the private way of a happy man, that this was what the cabin had been missing. In the spring of 1875, with the snow melting off the peaks and the creek running high in silver, Eliza told him she was going to have a child. She told him simply and directly, which was her way. They were at the breakfast table. She had been quiet for a few days, in a way he'd noticed but not pressed. She said it plainly, "I'm going to have a child. In the fall, I think." Cole set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the table, and his expression was the open lantern expression, fully and completely, without any of its usual composure. "In the fall," he said. "September, I think, from what Ruth says. She knows better than I do." He stood up from the table and came around to her side of it and pulled her carefully to her feet and held her, this large, mountain-built man holding his wife, and she felt him breathe, one long breath, steadying or releasing or both. She put her hands on his back and held on. "We'll need to add a room," he said into her hair. She laughed, a real, full laugh that surprised her with its freedom. That is the most perfectly practical response to this news. "I'm a practical man." "You are," she said, "and I love you for it." He pulled back just far enough to look at her face. "I love you," he said, and it was the same way he said everything true, plain and absolute and without decoration. "I love you more than I have any adequate way to say." "You say it adequately enough," she told him, and kissed him, and the spring morning came through the windows of their house and lay across them both. She told Thomas and Ruth that same afternoon. Thomas sat down on the porch steps as though his legs had decided the moment called for it, and then stood back up and embraced his sister for a long time. Ruth cried immediately and briefly and practically, and then said several things about the practical management of pregnancy at elevation that were entirely characteristic of her. Samuel, at 2.5, was told that there was going to be a baby, and responded by going directly to Cole and holding up his arms to be picked up, which Cole did, and the two of them regarded each other from their respective positions with the mutual gravity that had become their native conversational mode. Thomas recovered from the porch steps moment with the thoughtful efficiency that had always been his way. He and Cole had been talking through the summer about the possibility of expanding the Calloway homestead. Thomas's lungs were better, but not what they had been, and the heavy physical work of the farming operation was more than he could manage alone, and Cole had skills and knowledge of the local land that complemented what Thomas had built. They had been circling the subject with the practicality of men who are inclined toward something but want to think it all the way through before committing. Thomas brought it up directly on the evening of the news. "I think it's time we talked about the land properly," he said. They talked about it properly. Over several evenings sitting around Thomas's table with Ruth's coffee and the sound of the mountain night outside, the four of them, because Ruth was part of every significant decision in that household and Eliza was part of every significant decision in hers, talked through what a shared operation would look like. The valley land was good, better than most knew, with the river water and the long growing season at this elevation. Thomas had the acreage. Cole had the skills with horses and the knowledge of the upper country where the summer grazing was exceptional. Together, they could run cattle and horses, grow enough for both households, and build something that would last. They shook hands on it at the end of the third evening, and then Ruth laughed and said shaking hands seemed insufficient given that they were family, and they all laughed. And Samuel, who had woken from his nap and come downstairs in the way of children who have internal schedules of their own, arrived in the middle of the laughter and looked around with great satisfaction at being present for something enjoyable. Summer that year was long and warm, the high meadows green beyond anything the plains had prepared Eliza for. Cole took her riding in the high country when she was well enough, up to the mountain meadows where the wildflowers were extraordinary in July and August. Carpets of color spread between the peaks, and the elk moved in the early mornings in the long golden light. She carried their child and rode Copper with the same easy balance she'd developed on the trail. And Cole rode Red at her side and told her the names of things, the peaks and the valleys and the plants and the birds, and she memorized them with the same focused attention she brought to everything. "That one," she said one morning in August, pointing to a dark peak to the northwest. "What is that one?" "That's Calloway Peak," he said. She looked at him. "No, it isn't." "It is now," he said, completely seriously. "I named it this morning." She stared at him for a moment, and then dissolved into the kind of helpless laughter that had become one of the many things he lived for, bright and full and entirely hers. "You cannot name a mountain," she said. "I named my horse Red," he said. "I see no fundamental distinction." The baby came in September as expected, and it was a boy. He came in the night, as babies often do, with Ruth in attendance and Cole pacing the main room of the house with the concentrated patience of a man who could handle most things the mountain threw at him, but found this particular waiting nearly unbearable. Thomas sat with him for a while, and they did not talk much, which was appropriate, and then Ruth came to the door and said it was done, and both were well, and Cole was through the door before the sentence was complete. Eliza lay in their bed looking tired and luminous in the way that sometimes only exhaustion and joy together produce. And the baby was beside her in the wooden cradle Cole had made in the spring from cedar and pine, small and dark-haired and possessed, already, of a ferocious determination to make his presence known. Cole sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at Eliza, and was, for a while, unable to speak. She watched him not speaking and found that she did not need him to. "He looks like you," she said. Cole looked at the baby, the dark hair, the square jaw in miniature. "He has your eyes," he said. "Look. He has your eyes exactly." Eliza looked at her son's eyes, dark and alert and already engaged with the world. She thought about her father, who had built something from nothing on the Kansas plains and died before he could see what it would become. She thought about the letter that had come in April, a year and a half ago, and the men who had passed it along not knowing who it belonged to, and Cole Bridger arriving in Harrow Creek on a red Mustang with no intention of going anywhere near Granite Falls. "His name," Cole said. "Henry," she said, "for my father." Cole looked at her. "Henry Bridger," he said. "Henry Samuel Bridger," she said, which made Thomas's voice, who was in the doorway because Thomas had never been very good at waiting either, catch briefly. They brought Henry Samuel Bridger home to the life that had been built for him. The solid house in the mountain meadow, the valley view, the red Mustang grazing in the field below, the uncle and aunt and cousin half a mile down the lane. He was a decisive, vigorous child from the start, interested in everything and afraid of almost nothing, with his father's steadiness and his mother's sharpness, and the particular combination of the two that was entirely his own. Cole taught him to ride before he could walk well. Eliza read to him every evening, the same way she'd read to Cole through the winter, and Henry developed the concentrated listening face of his father and the exact vocabulary of his mother. Thomas taught him to fish in the river. Ruth taught him the names of the plants, the useful ones and the dangerous ones, with the practical educational philosophy she applied to everything. Samuel, at 3 and then 4 and then 5, was his first companion and occasional adversary in the complex politics of early childhood, and the two boys ranged the valley under the mountains with the freedom that country offered, and time would eventually curtail. In 1876, 18 months after Henry's birth, Eliza told Cole there was going to be another child. This one came in autumn of that year. A girl, small and fierce, with Cole's dark hair and the green eyes that had skipped Henry and come through from some deeper part of the family's combined story. They named her Clara, and she arrived with an opinion about everything and the vocal equipment to express it, which delighted the entire extended family. Cole held his daughter the first time and looked at her the way he had looked at mountains he was seeing for the first time, with the recognition of something that was going to be important for the rest of his life. Eliza watched him hold Clara and thought about the man who had told her he did not know how to make space for another person, and she felt, quietly and completely, that she had never been so happy in her life. The valley operation grew steadily over the following years. Cole and Thomas built the horse side of the business into something genuinely respected in the territory. Cole's understanding of horses, and particularly of working with difficult animals, a skill he'd developed in his years with Red, and before that with other wild things, gave him a reputation that spread through the surrounding settlements. Men came from as far away as Denver to trade for the Bridger Calloway horses. The cattle herd grew. Thomas's lungs held steady, and then improved further as the years of mountain air accumulated, and he worked with a reliability and energy that eventually surpassed what he'd been capable of before the illness, which was something Ruth credited to stubbornness, and Samuel credited to the cattle, and Eliza credited to contentment. Ruth had another child in 1877, a daughter they named Margaret, who was small and red-haired like her mother and had a temperament that Mrs. Park, on one of her visits from Cannon City, described as prepared. Samuel was Margaret's devoted older brother, and Henry was her frequent antagonist, and Clara was her best friend within 6 months of her arrival, which established a set of relationships that would persist for decades. Cole built the addition to the house the year before Henry was born, and then built another one when Clara arrived, and the house grew outward from its original 2 rooms in the gradual organic way of structures that are genuinely lived in. The cedar and pine walls seasoned and darkened over the years, and the place developed the particular quality of homes where people have been genuinely happy, a warmth in the surfaces and a settled ease in the proportions. Red lived to be 21 years old, which for a Mustang of his origins was an extraordinary age. He spent his final years in the best of the lower meadow pastures, grazing with the same dignified self-possession he had always maintained, occasionally being visited by Cole for no practical reason and by Henry, who had grown up with the horse as a constant presence and treated him with the respect due a founder. When Red died, in the spring, Cole found him in the morning, lying quietly in the meadow. He buried him properly, on the slope above the pasture where the horse had always gone when the weather was coming in, because that was the place Red had always chosen, and that was honor enough. Cole did not speak much for a day or two after, and Eliza did not fill the silence unnecessarily. She brought him coffee and sat beside him in the evenings and let him feel what needed to be felt, which was not the grief of sentiment, but the grief of genuine loss, 15 years of companionship and trust, a version of himself carried in the knowing of that one animal. "He chose you," she said on the second evening. "He did," Cole said. "And he was right too," she said. Cole looked at her, and she looked back at him with the clear, steady eyes that had first assessed him from a yard in Kansas with a rifle loose at her side, and everything that had happened between that morning and this evening was present in the look, and he reached over and took her hand. "He was right," Cole said. As the years turned through the late 1870s and into the 1880s, Granite Falls grew, not extravagantly, not the gold rush surge of the larger mining towns, but steadily, the growth of a place that was becoming settled in the truest sense of the word. New families arrived, the church was expanded, a school was built, which Eliza had campaigned for with a methodical determination that left the town council feeling that resistance had never been a practical option. She taught there for 2 years until the enrollment required a full-time teacher, at which point she found and hired one and transitioned into the role of school board chair, which she ran with the same focused intelligence. Thomas's health continued to hold. The mountains had done what the letter had promised. The altitude and the air and the work had rebuilt him from the inside, and by his mid-40s, he was as strong as he had been in his 20s, with none of the fragility the illness had imposed. He and Ruth had, by everyone's observation, the kind of marriage that looked easy from the outside, precisely because of the effort both of them put into it daily, the effort of two people who genuinely chose each other every morning. Cole and Eliza had the same thing, expressed in the idiom of their own particular natures, his steadiness and her directness, his quiet and her clarity, his way of expressing things by doing them, and her way of expressing things by saying them precisely, the combination of which produced a household where very little was assumed and very much was known. Henry grew into a young man of considerable physical presence. He had his father's height and the musculature that came from the same kind of work, and his mother's way of looking at the world with level, honest eyes. He had also, fortunately, his father's patience and his mother's stubbornness, and the combination made him, in the valley's collective estimation, a person worth knowing. He had his father's skill with horses and his uncle's skill with the land, and by the time he was 16, he was carrying genuine responsibility in the operation. Clara was, by universal agreement, her own category of person. She had intelligence that looked for edges and found them, humor that was dry and perfectly timed, and an opinion about virtually everything that she expressed without apology. She had her father's physical courage and her mother's refusal to accept unnecessary limits, and she grew up in the mountains knowing them from the inside in the way that only people who have run through them as children can know them. Cole took her into the high country regularly from the time she could sit a horse, and she absorbed the mountain knowledge with the same deep, wordless comprehension he had. In the evenings of those full years, Cole and Eliza often sat on the porch of the house they had built together, looking out over the valley they had lived in for more than a decade. The mountains changed with the seasons and the light and never quite repeated themselves, which Cole had told her on the trail and which remained true. It was always like the first time, and it was never the same. Below them in the meadow, whatever horses were running that year moved in the long evening light, and from the lane came, sometimes, the voices of the children, Henry and Clara and Samuel and Margaret, and whoever else was ranging the valley that afternoon. "Do you miss the plains?" he asked her once on one of those evenings. She thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," she said, "the light on the plains in the late afternoon, the way the grass moves in the wind, there is nothing quite like it. Do you want to go back?" She looked at him. "No," she said simply. "This is home." He nodded, satisfied. "Do you miss—" she started, and then stopped. "Moving?" he said. He looked out at the valley. "Not anymore. I used to think that movement was the thing itself, that being in the next piece of country was the point. But the next piece of country was just where I hadn't been yet. Here is where I am." He looked at her. "You are where I am." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had learned was exactly the right height for this, and he put his arm around her, and the evening came on golden and quiet over the mountains. The letter from Thomas had said, "Come." And she had come on the back of a bay gelding named Copper, across the whole wide Kansas and Nebraska territory, through weather and wind and river crossings, and a mountain pass still white with late snow. She had come behind a man on a red Mustang who rode with the certainty of someone the country trusted, who had answered her honest questions honestly, who had built her a house with his own hands, and who said everything true in the same plain, absolute way that she had fallen in love with by the third day of the trail, though she had not admitted it to herself until later. Thomas was alive and recovering. Ruth was everything the letter had promised. Samuel had grown from the 18-month-old whose existence she had wept over in a cold Kansas kitchen into a serious, capable young man who looked startlingly like Thomas and had more than a little of Ruth's red hair coming through. Margaret was her best friend in the way that a much younger cousin sometimes becomes, with the particular bond of shared blood and shared valley and shared history. Henry was 17 and already more a man than a boy, with his father's dark hair and steadiness and his mother's clear eyes. And Eliza watched him sometimes working with Cole in the corral or riding up into the high meadows, and felt, in the most private part of herself, a gratitude so large it had no adequate container. Clara was 15 and already had 3 boys from town doing their earnest best to convince her they were worth knowing, which she regarded with the tolerant skepticism of someone who had better things to think about and knew it. Cole watched this development with the specific expression of a father who is both proud and reluctant to acknowledge the full implications, which Eliza found privately hilarious and told him so. On a May morning in 1884, 10 years after Cole had ridden his red Mustang into Harrow Creek, Kansas territory, and heard a storekeeper telling a story about a young woman with a letter and no way west, 10 years since the flat spring plains and the river crossings and the mountain pass and the last camp on the trail and the fire by the river bend, Cole saddled one of the young horses from the valley herd, a dark bay with a blaze that reminded him, slightly, of someone, and rode out before dawn into the high country above the valley. He reached the upper meadow as the sun came over the eastern ridge and filled the valley below with the slanted gold of early morning. The mountains were all around him, the permanent ones, the ones whose names he had given Eliza one by one. Below, in the meadow, the house was visible, not small, not anymore, extended and solid and full of the life that had accumulated in it. A column of smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney where Eliza was making coffee, which she always did first thing, and would continue to do every morning of her life because some habits were better than their alternatives. He sat the horse on the upper meadow and looked down at the house in the valley and felt what he had been feeling for 10 years, the specific satisfaction of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for and has held onto it with both hands. He had ridden a wild Mustang across the dangerous plains to bring a woman a letter from her kin. He had not expected to stay. He had not expected that the woman herself would become the destination, that the letter was only the beginning of a story that was larger and better and more enduring than anything a man riding alone through wild country could have imagined. He rode back down to the valley, unsaddled the horse, and went inside to the smell of coffee and the sound of his wife's voice reading something aloud to Clara, who was apparently unconvinced and was making her case in the direct, precise language she had come by honestly from both sides of her inheritance. Cole poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table and listened to the argument, which was good-natured and intelligent and showed no signs of resolving quickly, and he drank the coffee and felt, completely and without reservation, at home. Outside, the mountains stood in the May morning, permanent and blue and full of elk moving through their ancient meadows. The valley was green and wide beneath them. Down the lane, at the Calloway homestead, Thomas would be starting his own morning, and Samuel would be out early with the horses in the way that had become his vocation, and Margaret would be assisting Ruth in the garden with the practical thoroughness she had inherited from her mother. The school at the edge of town would open at 8, and the teacher Eliza had hired and trained would stand before her students, and the children of Granite Falls would learn the things that mattered, which was in part what Eliza had always intended and had always made happen, because she was the kind of person who made things happen. Henry would come by after his morning work in the corral, and he and Cole would ride the upper fence line to check the section that the winter had been hard on, and they would work together in the easy silence of two people who knew each other thoroughly and did not need the silence filled. And in the evening, they would all come together, as families do, around tables and fire and the ordinary, extraordinary business of living, and the valley would hold them in its mountain hands, and the story would go on. Eliza looked up from the book as Cole came to sit at the table, and she smiled at him. The full, unguarded smile that she had first given him somewhere in the middle of Nebraska territory when he said something dry about naming a horse. And he looked back at her across the morning kitchen with everything that had ever passed between them in his eyes, and she held his gaze for a moment and then went back to her argument with Clara, who was making an excellent point. He drank his coffee. He was exactly where he belonged.